In the first video on Napoleonic historiography, we tried to quickly look at the idea of what a historical debate is, and we also began to focus quickly on the issue of the debate around Napoleon's influence on France and Europe and some of the issues that historians tend to disagree on. So just quickly recapping, we're suggesting that a historical debate is a formal, informal contest over meaning and memory of a particular event, and it's usually played out through all of a society's cultural endeavors. So formal publishing by historians, the media, films, dramatic films, documentaries, whatever, the internet, so blogs, internet archives, whatever it is, and also social media can become involved in this as well. And this is really, I think, the central point, is that it is a debate or a discussion or a contest over how something is remembered and what its meaning essentially should be. This is the argument about what its meaning should be. What I want to do in this video is have a look at how we might begin to periodize Napoleonic historiography, and this is fairly rough, so we don't want to take this as the way to break down Napoleonic historiography, but one way you might begin to think about how it's changed over the course of the last few hundred years. So let's use the time frame from Napoleon's rise to power as first consul in 1799 through to the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo in 2015. I'm going to argue that I think it's helpful to think of four phases. Phase one being between 1799 and 1840, which, as we'll look at in a bit more detail in a second, was the year in which Napoleon's remains were brought back from St. Helena and repatriated in Paris. The second phase, I'm going to suggest, goes from that repatriation through to the end of the Second World War, so about 105 years. The third phase, I'm going to suggest, goes from about the end of the Second World War, 1945, through to roughly the year 2000, so the end of the century, the end of the millennium. And the fourth phase really brings us up to the present day, and that's from 2000 to about 2015. Now, obviously, we're beyond 2015 now, so certainly bring in sources beyond that, but this is just relatively neat for the purposes, the present purposes. So let's break down each of those periods in a little more detail. Phase 1, 1799 to 1840. What I'm suggesting here is this goes from the first consulship when Napoleon is given power. Obviously, he doesn't become emperor until 1804, but he certainly emerges as the primary figure in French politics in 1799 through to the repatriation of his body in 1840. What the general characteristics of this period tend to revolve around the idea of the development of the Napoleonic legend. So initiated certainly by Napoleon himself. His military bulletins spoke very proudly of his military conquests, and his propaganda that he organized certainly developed an image of him as that great Superman leader. Not the mortal human, but the Superman leader who had, in a sense, powers beyond the normal individual. And I should add that he used that primarily for good, in his view. The legend was then pushed forward by individuals like Emmanuel de las Casas in his memorial from the island of St. Helena, published in 1823, a couple of years after Napoleon's death. But there's certainly others as well. He's just the one that we focused on in the table that we produced in class. But the legend, the important point here is it's not just being developed by Napoleon, but also other influential members of his inner circle. At the same time, as we've seen, there was a strong tradition developed in this time of a critical approach to Napoleon. And this started with writers like people like Madame de Staël or Chateaubriand, who were arguing essentially, I think because, or at least partly because, they were marginalized by the regime, arguing that Napoleon's methods had been quite despotic and his influence in many ways was detrimental to French people and the people of Europe. So there's both views developing here, that legend and what Jeffrey Ellis calls the Black Legend, both emerge in this first 40-year period, essentially around Napoleon's life. I know he died in 1821, but essentially think of this as the period surrounding his life and rule as first consul, then emperor, and then the repatriation of his body, which is a very big propagandic event. The second phase, I think, runs from about 1840 to 1945. This is when basically Napoleon's body was repatriated up to the end of the Second World War. And According to Peter Geil, this is basically a period in which that tradition of binary interpretations, the legend versus black legend, continued to play out. So this is how he, in a sense, comes to his conclusion that this Napoleon for and against is really an argument without end. So there's certainly a strong development of the legendary image of Napoleon, but also certainly strong critics of Napoleon in this period as well. Very polemical texts being developed by the critics, and also very hagiographic images being developed by some of Napoleon's supporters. That doesn't make every work of history in this period either a hagiography or a polemic, but they are certainly more, I think, frequent in this period than perhaps closer to our own times. So the figures that we've talked about in class are Adolphe Thiers, who wrote his 20-volume work on Napoleon, and Peter Geil and Geoffrey Ellis and others argue that this brought really forward the whole legendary image of Napoleon. And remember, Adolphe Thiers was a French politician. He is the first president of the Third Republic, which is born out of the Prussian conquest of France in 1870-71. And although he'd written his volumes already on Napoleon, there's certainly an argument to be had here that Thiers, who was a very nationalistic, Anglophobic, so very critical of the English, an Anglophobic politician, is going to look back on someone like Napoleon with a degree of nostalgia. That he saw Napoleon as someone who did, in fact, bring stability and power to France, which helped it resist a whole series, 7 coalitions. So he's going to suggest, I think, in the wake of their conquering the Prussian conquest of France, that a ruler like Napoleon is perhaps someone to actually look up to in French history. Critical writers, on the other hand, people like the example that we've used in class, Jules Barni. Jules Barni is a French philosopher and really into liberal philosophy at this point. Very, very strong critic of anything remotely similar to despotic political measures. And Barni really, in his series of lectures that were published in a book, basically sets out to critique Adolphe Thiers' interpretation in this book, or this series of books. And you can see here, he's French as well, this idea that this debate that Geil was talking about, this binary interpretations, had not disappeared. And it often had to do with not so much nationality, because we've got 2 French historians here, or 2 French commentators, but political ideology. Barni being a liberal, Adolphe Thiers not necessarily being illiberal, but certainly not being as critical of despotic measures as perhaps someone like Jules Barni is. Okay, so there's an important point here that there is political themes, but there are also personal themes. One of the themes I think that you might want to keep your eye on is this idea that some of the historiography seems to fluctuate with the fate of the French nation. Now, this is not explaining everything about the historiography of this period, but it's one important thing to keep an eye on. As France is, say, conquered by an outside power like Prussia, it's possible to argue that some people are more sympathetic to positive interpretations of Napoleon because they basically long for the restored glory of the French nation. So in those circumstances, people are perhaps more willing to relive the Napoleonic legend image of Napoleon rather than some sort of critical image developed by other scholars. As I said, that doesn't explain everything, but it might be a helpful theme to think about as you develop your interpretation of someone like Adolphe Thiers. The third phase, 1945 to 2000, this is basically from the end of the Second World War through to the end of the 20th century, and I'm suggesting this is quite rough. To 2000 doesn't really mean anything specific. This is obviously 1945, obviously much more specific, but 2000 is just a fairly neat date. So take that fairly loosely. But in that, basically the latter half of the 20th century, there were still lovers and haters, sure. So Napoleon had his detractors, and Napoleon had those who still supported the Napoleonic legend image. What I think is the important development in the debate, though, is that's nothing new. The thing that's new in the debate in this period, I think, is the different kinds of history that are beginning to be used to develop interpretations of Napoleon and his influence on France and Europe. So, for example, from the 1930s, and that's again pretty rough, certainly from the 50s and 60s, the rise and influence of social history has an important expansion, expands the debate quite broadly about Napoleon, and then also the cultural histories from the 1970s. But let's just quickly focus on specifically the social histories. Let's look at three examples. Certainly, Lefebvre, the French Marxist, is looking at Napoleon's reforms or lack of reforms in terms of the working classes of France and Europe. And his argument essentially is that Napoleon's influence on those groups was essentially negative. Why? Because he argues that Napoleon had basically overlooked any meaningful reform for the labouring working classes of France and then by extension Europe as his empire began to spread. And so as a Marxist, he's keenly aware of class relations and he's keenly aware of working class politics, and his view in the end is that Napoleon, his influence on this particular group in society was negative, and therefore he can't be seen as some positive, progressive liberator. In fact, in Lefebvre's view, Napoleon's rule really favoured the bourgeoisie very much over the working classes. So his view is negative, but it's not necessarily polemic, calling Napoleon evil or something like that. His view is critical, but it's reasoned out. Bonnie Smith, the American feminist, she argues something similar, but in relation to the Napoleonic Code of 1804, where she sees a basic absence of any rights for women developed in that particular legal code. And so where some historians have said the Napoleonic Code was a great progressive piece of legislation, Bonnie Smith is arguing that really it's actually not progressive at all for women. So she's suggesting that it's certainly very limited in Napoleon's influence here. It can't be seen as positive in that regard. In fact, she says that it relegated women to a kind of a secondary role in society. And by extension, she suggests, because it was expanded and used in various parts of Europe, it actually had a very negative impact on women of Europe, not just of France. So again, a very critical perspective, but one that's reasoned out from an obvious, politically guided interpretation of this history. And finally, Geoffrey Ellis, not so much a social historian, but someone who you might consider to be a historian who tries to have drawn on the complexity of debate throughout the 20th century. And his writings focus pretty much on the Napoleonic Empire, and his conclusions really are that, taking into account the arguments of people like Lefebvre and Bonnie Smith and many others, his image of the Napoleonic Empire is that its influence on France, the French people, and on European people was very imbalanced. So you can't say he's suggesting that it had one influence on all of those very various groups. What he's suggesting is that we have to basically look at each area of the Grand Empire and try to think about it in its own unique terms. And his conclusion is that basically, overall, Napoleon's influence was quite negative, but this is there were certain areas of the empire in which it seems to have been more positive. So a nuanced, balanced, critical evaluation of Napoleon, someone developing and drawing his interpretation from the complexity of history that is grown up throughout the 20th century. So the point here is that although many writers certainly remained critical, I'm suggesting many of them also avoid a more polemical critique of Napoleon. He was an evil monster, a despotic tyrant who was oppressing the people of Europe. They're not wildly emotional in their claims, but they are certainly critical in their claims. Many of them, not all of them. Finally, if we look at the last period here that we're discussing, Phase 4, 2000 through to the current day, I'm suggesting that we think of this as the bicentenary season, or the season of bicentenaries. So, for example, 1799, Napoleon becomes first consul. That's celebrated or remembered at its 200-year juncture in 1999. Also, in 1815, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. That was remembered in its bicentenary of 2015. So there are a number of other dates we could pick here, but let's just use those two as examples. Now, it's the case with most centenaries and big anniversaries that historical attention becomes much more public again. It goes in waves, I think. So, for example, think about Anzac in Australia. For many years, it was certainly a debate, but it didn't have the public profile that it currently does because of the centenary of the First World War. So the centenary has done a lot to bring Anzac back to the surface. In the same way, I think that Napoleon's, at least I should say, the bicentenary of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo has brought up arguments again. People asking questions like, what would have happened if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? Was Napoleon really a good emperor or not? All of these questions have come rushing back to the surface in books, in the media, and so on. So there's still strong commentary on Napoleon. That's the point. The debate is still going, and it's still very public, and it's still very at the forefront of European historical discussions. There's also, importantly, new sources continually being added. As some of the feminists and the Marxists have gone back and looked at old sources again, there's also new sources being added to the picture. So, for example, the 33,000 letters released by the Napoleonic Foundation in France, who Andrew Roberts has argued informed a large part of his interpretation of Napoleon. There are also, this is an important thing to follow, is in the 2015-2016 debates about the European Union currently rolling on, particularly with Brexit. The debate and the vote is coming up soon in 2016. The eccentric ex-mayor of London, Boris Johnson, came out last month, I think, in May or April of this year, 2016, and suggested that Napoleon's rule was akin to that of Hitler, and also he likens the current EU to all of those, suggesting, basically, obviously not suggesting that the EU was some murderous regime like Hitler's regime, but certainly arguing that it is undemocratic and essentially imperial like Hitler and Napoleon were before it. So incredibly critical implications for the way we see and remember Napoleon if we take Boris Johnson's view. Now, the important point here is that this is certainly not Boris Johnson being an academic historian and not being someone who's trying to gather source material, test it, and develop a reasoned conclusion, but someone who is trying to use the image of Napoleon for his own purposes. And this is an important thing. The way history is used and abused is an important part of the debate. So it's possible that we could see this here as some return to some of the earlier polemics that we saw in, say, the first phase here of 1799 to 1840, where people were very wildly emotional in their views of Napoleon. Now, I'm not saying that's what everyone thinks now, but I'm saying that maybe there are some elements of this creeping back into the debate, where in the late 20th century, maybe people were a bit more considered in their approach, a bit more distance in their judgment, and we had a greater variety of history emerging. Some of this polemical division has returned, perhaps. Now, I would be careful about making too great a point about that, but it might be a question that you could raise in your essay. Does this reflect a return to the very divided views of Napoleon that were certainly dominant in the earliest phase of history?